To justify ruling the world, the British came up with ideas such as the white man's burden, the scale of civilization, and empire as a trust. From the early 20th century, the Germans claimed to need living space. The Japanese explained their military expansionism in the 1930s as a quest for co-prosperity with Asian peoples. All the colonialists of the 19th and the 20th centuries regarded the people they invaded to be lost and unenlightened. They were thought not to be making the most of what they had and could only be transformed through the power of positive example. But what if a colonised people were not content to be docile? What if they had a sophisticated culture of their own that could be thought enviable as the Greeks were under the Roman Empire? The Chinese people were steeped in history and art. They were insatiably political and more urbane than their invader. But the British were in charge of a vast military and mercantile empire, the likes of which the world had never seen, and this gave them ample cause for self-regard. In the 19th century, these two proud peoples would come into a fatal conflict over territory and trade. In order to run smoothly, a British colony such as Hong Kong or Wei required a little more than the might of the garrison or the repressive apparatus of legalised racism. The British had to create a thin crust of upper middle class Chinese to give consent to their rule. Internal laws of property rewarded such Chinese and curbed a nationalist narrative that a colony should return to the Chinese motherland. Such laws could also censure those who conceived that another nationality might make a better colonial master. But the legal discourse was not only reactive. By emphasising investment in land and the building of houses for the purpose of residence, the British also charted a course that rewarded any who followed their gods. Of course, the British were not adverse to using force to hold on to one of their Chinese possessions. To prevent the fall of Shanghai to nationalists in 1927, the British ensconced the international settlement with barbed wire, choked through the river with warships, and called in 20,000 troops. These were not the acts of a colonial power ruling by defining and rewarding a coterie, but by a threat of violence. Nevertheless, the British were adept at controlling access to private property to counter nationalist and competing colonial agendas within their colonies and concessions. Abstaining from nationalist agitation was a precondition to residence and commercial success in a British colony, and property law stands out as an instrument of this policy. The nationalist politics of Hong Kong's industrial lobby made emergence of a more greatly liberal and self-determining mode of government in Hong Kong rather unlikely. But the British had not objected to Kuomintang investment in the colony's factory sector before or after the war. One example was the China Vegetable Oil Company of Kowloon. It was owned by senior members of the KMT political studies clique in Chongqing. The company's oil expressing and refinery machinery was taken by the occupying Japanese in 1941, as were its machine tools and laboratory equipment. Such was the profit of the enterprise, however, that it restarted after the war in Hong Kong with no help from the British. In light of the China vegetable oil example, it was a little surprised that the British took no responsibility for Hong Kong's factory losses. While the British did not prevent KMT investment, they were not in the business of helping their enemy after the war either. Chin Park was a Chinese collaborator in Japanese Hong Kong from 1941 to 1945, and he serves as an example of the way the British would freely diminish the commercial fortunes of any who dabbled in politics that were antithetical to their aims. He was the chief beneficiary in the construction and renovation trade during the Japanese occupation. For refurbishing Government House, the Japanese gifted him a house in the consular district of Kowloon Tong, along with other perks. He stayed on in Hong Kong after the Japanese withdrew. In 1946, he was unable to resist supplying the ready market in British Hong Kong for food, clothing and footwear, so he landed a consignment of these items, and it was valued at 30,000 Hong Kong dollars. The British Mandarinate, finding that the goods had been landed without an import licence, confiscated the entire consignment and on-sold it. Chin Park was furious. In his claim for compensation, he asked, why was Hong Kong refusing to allow payment for the goods when they had been admitted and allowed them to be resold? The British brushed him off by saying that he could apply for an import licence retrospectively, but that such a licence could be refused, leading to the return of the goods to the company they came from, or they could be confiscated if there is evidence of bad faith. The officer felt no need to elaborate any further. His position was that a certain level of collaboration would be forgiven, but that it did matter who controlled the colony. Whether the seeker of favour had been pro-Japanese or pro-KMT, there had to be a business environment of consequence for such people. Chin Park eventually secured passage for him and his family to Boston in the United States.